Okay. So when we think diagnosis, we think illness. I think personally, my experience has been anxiety, right? Question. I have really horrible handwriting. I really should have thought about that part.
What is that?
Question.
Questions.
Yeah, questions, anxiety, from discomfort. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to this. Like, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think of diagnosis?
First thing when she got there, said, "Why me?"
Why me?
Everyone says it. The minute she said, "Why me?" Why not some bad person we know? You know, we know some of them. You know, why me?
I had a different experience with when I finally got a diagnosis. I think we have two sides of it.
Right.
Because for me, I fought for so long, knowing I was sick with something, but everybody kept telling me there was nothing wrong with me.
Right.
So when I actually got a diagnosis, I was actually relieved. Because then I had a direction to at least fight.
Right.
But you knew it wasn't terminal.
No, at that point, I only probably would have lived maybe a few more months. I was already to the point where the disease had almost taken me.
Right.
I was pretty darn sick.
You were from 120 pounds to 300 pounds, right?
Yeah, and I could barely walk anymore. My heart was going, you know, so I was, with Cushing's disease, it will kill you eventually if you don't have it treated. And I was getting there. So the more I was told there's nothing wrong with me, but the sicker I was getting, the worse it was to keep living that way.
Right.
Because how sick was I going to get before I got a diagnosis of something? So for me,
for you
when I
it was
got the
relief.
diagnosis, it was relief. I didn't know if I could get, you know, if we would ever find the tumor. The tumor wasn't seen on the MRI. And was I going to get better? But
You did not show on the MRI?
No.
Am I going to get better?
For Dan. But with what I did have was then a diagnosis of somewhere to start getting help, which was better than not getting help.
Right. So there's relief, and then on the opposite side of the spectrum, there's fear, right?
Exactly. The unknown.
Okay. I think the important thing, though, to distinguish is between, I like to make a distinguish between a diagnosis and illness, whereas they can be seen as the same thing. For the purpose of tonight, I'm going to talk about them as two different things. I'm going to talk about illness as being the experience that you have. So Charmin, for you, like your experience of relief, of finally finding out what it is that you have been undergoing and have been told it's all these different things, and then you fighting and being like, no, it's not. And so your experience of relief is different than the diagnosis or the actual disease, which is what the doctor or the diagnostician is seeing through the lens of their physical exams or their labs, right? So those are two very different things. This is your experience of it, and this is how they classify you in terms of medical terms. But this becomes a label, right? This becomes sort of something that gets imposed upon us. And the reason why I think it's important to focus on experience is because tonight I'm talking about like sense of self. When I talk about sense of self, oh gosh, all I'm really talking about is our identity.
Yeah.
Right? And this is just comprised of how we make sense of ourselves, who we are, based on our experience in the world. And it can seem really small, like, but I'm actually going to argue tonight that our experiences, right, are tied to our interactions with others, right? Like we don't have meaning and experiences without all these other interactions with people, with doctors, with institutions like St. John's. Without this place to come, we wouldn't have a meaning of a support group. And also within like a larger cultural frame that we live in. So to have, with that said, it means context matters. meaning that each person's experience is different,
Yeah, very different.
right? Depending on a lot of things. So, any ideas of some of the ideas of what some of those things could be?
Yeah, I always notice with patients, because I talk to so many of them, that, you know, I always say that pituitary disease is just icing on their already unbaked cake. Because what I found through the years is most of us came from a lot of dysfunction before we ever got the diagnosis. So then you have this illness, and when you have the illness, all these things that you never dealt with in life, or that you kind of pushed away, or that maybe seemed like you had gotten past them, become bigger than life. Because now you have an illness, plus you have some wounds from the past, and you're trying to deal with the illness, but you're actually this person that, so you relate that this person is the disease, whereas really you have a disease and you have issues to deal with. They don't have to be the same.
And they don't have to be the same, and that every person experiences them differently. So for example, one way we experience illness differently is gender, right? I mean, and this is what I mean by cultural, how we're informed by cultural norms, right? How does gender speak to how we should think or feel or act in terms of our illness, right? I mean, traditional Western ideas would say that men are taught to be strong. You can't be weak. So I don't know if any men in the room could speak to that, like what it's been like to cope with the illness, and has gender had a role in that at all?
For myself? I discovered very hardly. I was on a training ride in Griffith Park on a Sunday with 20, 30 guys. At the end there's a sprint. And the guy came by me, right? And usually I was one of the best sprinters in Southern California. Didn't see him until he was over here. I said, that's kind of odd, with my left eye.
Oh, wow.
I discovered it. So I said, that's weird, and I kept, going like this. And on a freeway sometimes when you travel, you see a car in front of you with a license plate. It's very clever. You're trying to figure it out. Do you know what it means? You know, the abbreviation. And I closed my right eye. I could see very sharp. Left eye all fuzzy. So I went to an eye doctor in Century City who showed me nameless. He said, "Oh, you have glaucoma." Well, I was in my 40s, right? In early 40s and stuff. I called a friend of mine I went to school with in Europe. He said, "Dean, glaucoma doesn't come in 6 months. First of all, you're mostly in the 70s, late 60s, etc." Right? So I went to Jules Stein across the street. Jules Stein Eye Clinic. You guys probably know what that is, right? So the glaucoma specialist took one look at me with this, enlarged stethoscope, whatever. He said, "No, you don't have glaucoma. Sit still." So the nerve specialist came and he said to me, "Your right eye is beautifully, the vein is beautifully red blood and everything, very, very fully saturated. The left one is extremely pale. You should have an MRI." I went the next day, MRI, that's on it there. And the next thing I went up there and he said, "You see it on the screen, it was the size of a golf ball. What we call a macroadenoma. I had the size of a golf ball in there." So I said to him, he said, "It should come out." I said, "Can we do it tomorrow?" You'll have to. So, that's how I discovered it. And I just figured, how do I get rid of it? That was mine. And they said, "What's the danger?" He said, "Well, surgery is always dangerous, but nowadays we do it intranasal, and we learned all this." And one thing, as you know, that's why sometimes I talk to new people when we have here, like you do. I went for 2 weeks. They said 2 weeks ahead from the time I met Dr. Kelly. I went every day riding in the park, like 5, 6 days a week, really hard with a high heart rate, like 190, 180, 90 for an hour. So I came in on Monday morning at 6 o'clock to UCLA and walked out under my own power at 4 the next day, 4 in the afternoon.
Yes,
He said, "It's the fastest patient you ever," and he said, "Dean, it's only because the physical shape, and luckily I was in. So that's why, remember that Chinese girl was crying and so on. So that's also why I come here, some people sometimes, it's scary when they're saying, a brain operation.
Yeah.
Once you're in the brain, you're never the same. It's an old saying. I mean, I don't know if you heard that, but you had a pituitary, how long ago?
He's a veteran.
1992.
Oh, Long time ago. That's good. So for me, it wasn't really.
But I'm going to just pose this question. Do you think perhaps that maybe your persistence in moving forward in the way that you did and your strength in that could be tied to sort of your identity as a man or not?
Did we have any women who were kind of like me? No.
I'm sure.
Well, there are a few.
I'm not making generalization.
In general, but Dean is a little bit of an exception. A lot of it, and it also depends. Like he got a quick diagnosis, and but there are many men that we have where they've been sick for many years and didn't go to the doctor. And then the tumors are very large.
Well, mine was, he said, I never had a headache. He said he's never had a patient with this size tumor or never had a headache.
Jerry, did you have headaches with your large tumor? Yeah. Jerry also had a very large tumor. And but most of the time I think that
it's flexible,
like you're saying,
it's fluid.
It is a gender thing.
It's not a solid tumor. It's not a solid tumor. It's like a very soft.
And they don't go to the doctor.
Right.
And they don't talk about a lot of their symptoms.
Right.
And I get a lot of men that that will say, I say, did you not have symptoms? I mean, and they tell me, no, I didn't have any symptoms. And then I tell them what the symptoms are, and they say, oh yeah, I had that.
That's what Dan said. It's amazing.
So their level of maybe checking in with themselves may be different than a woman who's used to going to annual OBGYN appointments, or a different level of medical care.
In general, men go to the doctor much less than women.
So all I'm trying to do is just to take into consideration like all these different sort of expectations that or experiences we may have may be influenced by some of, not just gender, but some of these other subcultures that we exist in, right? So one of them is gender. I mean, others would be family and friends, right? We all have a family, right? Of some kind. We all have friends of some kind. And what has your experience been of how your family and friends have influenced how you think you should feel about your illness, or how you think you should act in regards to it?
That's a really good one for pituitary patients because it's so unknown and that it's not familiar to to the public, and so a lot of patients are very ill, but because family members or friends have not heard of the disease, they say, how could it be that serious when I've never even heard of it? If it was really a disease, I would have heard of it.
That's a funny comment.
Yeah, and I hear that all the time. And the patient's so sick, and that they tend to think they're a hypochondriac, and they're you just need to think positive, and you just need to get over it. I mean, if you just did this, you'd feel better. And then that patient calls me and says, would you speak to these family members? So I have a conversation with them, and it's usually not very nice because, like I tell them, listen, just because you are uneducated doesn't take any less of this illness. Educate yourself. This is a serious illness. Patients, your spouse, your sister, your brother are very ill. Until this disease is controlled, they are not going to feel well. As positive as you want to be, you don't tell someone that has brain cancer or something, just think positive. This is a serious illness. And yes, there are these things that we have to deal with when we have an illness, but we also have to look at the physiological damage that it's done as well.
Also, remember, it's still the most misdiagnosed
disease
in the entire world.
Yes.
Switzerland, Germany, anywhere in the world. Still,
any
people
country.
go on and on and on. They don't think of pituitary.
Right. So
still very undereducated about.
How quickly did you discover yours?
Once I went to the doctor, it was within a couple of days I had surgery.
wow.
No, I mean, initially, did somebody, the first doctor you went to, or whoever it was in the service, did they know it was pituitary? Discovered it? Usually it's not the case.
men get a quicker diagnosis.
We've had people
sometimes.
here, they've been to 5, 6, 8 different doctors.
Oh,
And everybody said, oh, you know, and they didn't know.
That
Nobody
actually,
thought of it.
and that brings up a thing that a lot of people don't think about too, is one of the cultures that is important is the physician culture, right? Because how is your interaction with your medical doctors, how has that influenced how you think and feel and act, especially about yourself, right? So if you go in and you're being told, no, you don't have a problem, you're just depressed, right? You should just go out and exercise more, or, you know, and you go undiagnosed for a period of time, you start to wear and become an identity of, oh, well, maybe I am just depressed, right? Because there's an authority here.
Right.
There's an authority in a diagnosis. When a diagnosis is given, it's a label that, you know, we go, in Western culture, we go to these doctors and we expect to be told sort of what's wrong with us and how to treat it and how to feel better. So if we're told that nothing's wrong with us, even though we may feel otherwise, we're probably going to err on the side that something's probably not wrong with us.
Depending, I think, totally on your own being, on your personality.
On your own personality and
Like,
experience,
you know,
of
I'm one
course.
people doesn't take no for an answer.
Right.
You know,
Me
so
too,
I'm
thank
by
God.
nature, you know. So, and anybody else probably would say, oh, what exactly what you're saying.
Right, and we obviously have fighters in this room, and I think that's why we have this support group running, right? I mean, part of your, I don't want to speak for you, but it sounds like part of your advocacy is because
Right.
this is so underdiagnosed,
Yeah,
and
of
such.
course.
So many people have had the experience of it being overlooked, right? And so another thing that we don't often think about too is insurance. Like this is a whole culture,
It is.
right? We don't,
Horrible culture.
right? Like how? I mean, I can relate on different levels. Like how do we feel when we get diagnosed with something and then
And
or
we can't get the treatment.
we can't get the treatment, right? Do we start to feel rejected? Our sense of ourselves
Start to panic.
starts to become one of rejection. We can start to take that on.
I see it a lot. I see it a lot because a lot of the patients have either no insurance or poor insurance, and I find that like I may be speaking with them, and then when they get rejected, they start their symptoms accelerate, and maybe they do and maybe they don't. I mean maybe it is psychological, maybe it isn't. You know, because stress puts a lot of pressure on a patient.
Right.
But I do notice that a lot of times when they're told they can't have the MRI, then I start to hear them start to panic and the headaches get worse.
Mhm.
Or it seems that they all of a sudden have more symptoms.
Right. So I mean, this could, and I'm not saying that all these things are negative. They could be positive. You could have a positive experience with insurance. You could have, you know, they could pay for everything, and then you could end up feeling like you're very valued, or your physician could have diagnosed you right away, and you could feel heard and valued in that situation. But I think that so much of the time we live under this umbrella of Western ideals, right? That sort of say that this is an internal problem with internal solutions, and that this sense of self becomes really small. And what I'm suggesting is that this sense of self is actually really large and dependent on all these things. And we start to make sense of ourselves in our interaction with our doctors, right? Like if we leave the doctor and we feel like, oh God, he gets it, like I finally feel like he gets it, then we walk out with this sense of feeling heard. If we walk out feeling like, I've had the experience of being told, oh, you're too young to have that, this many problems. I walk out leaving feeling like I'm a person with too many problems. I'm a problem-saturated person, right? I mean, or another thing is medication too. What's our experience with medication? How many medications have we been on? Have we said that we wanted to be on different medications or not on medication? What's our experience been like? I know I personally been in and been like, I want to come off this medication, and been told, oh no, you can't do that. You know, you have to be on it. Or I've been on a medication that develops a dependency, and I moved away, and I happened to have to go and get more of that medication, and I was sort of seen as like an addict. I sort of had to come off as an addict because I was like, you know, I'm actually in need of this medication. I'm running out, and they start to look at me like, what are you really? What are you? Yeah. Right. I'm like, whoa, wait a second, and it's all in the context because I was actually in graduate school at the time. So if you think about it, I was at USC on campus. So they're probably looking at me like, oh, another college kid coming in looking for a benzodiazepine, you know. And that, right. So, but what I really was trying to communicate was, hey, listen, I have a real problem here, and I feel like you're looking at me like I just have an addiction. And so I sort of left there feeling shamed.
So now you itemized all these problems. How do you counteract them?
Okay, well, that's a good question. And can I just touch on a few more things?
Sure.
So they're not necessarily always problems. When I bring them up, I want to just bring them up in a sense of things to pay attention to. Because like I said, I think that our culture is designed in a way that we don't look at those things. We look at ourselves like it's our problem. We feel this way because it's our fault, right? We tend to self-blame a lot. But there's other things I wanted to touch on, like religion, because I think this is often really overlooked in healthcare. Like, does your religion ascribe to traditional views of medicine, non-traditional views of medicine? Have you had an experience of your religion being honored in medicine? Like, what would that look like if it had been? What does it look like if you feel like it hasn't been? If religion's not something that's not important to you, perhaps this doesn't even seem like an important experience. But if it is...
How could religion help or not help? I don't get that.
Well, if you were particularly, let's say you were a Christian Scientist, and you really found that you needed to go get some medical care, but you're in a conversation with a doctor that's not acknowledging just how hard it is for you to actually go into that office and talk about healthcare options because they don't believe in it.
Scientists not supposed to go to
No.
What?
It's mind over matter. I mean,
Really?
yeah,
I
it would
didn't know that.
frown upon that, yeah.
It's kind of ignorant, isn't it?
But there are people that are, but not to them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem. And
Christian
there's people,
Scientists, really? They're not supposed to seek medical help?
there's other religions too that
Mhm.
are not allowed to have blood transfusion.
Right. So
or
if
give their children medicine.
So there's like particular things that could be going in your religion that maybe you don't, and if it's a marginalized religion, right, if it's one that's not of the dominant culture, one that we don't know about on the mainstream, we go into a conversation with the doctor and it's overlooked, we just get a feeling of being further marginalized. So it's hard to be of that marginalized religion and to be the person to speak up because you're already feeling small. So it's things to take into consideration. And also, too, if religion is something that's important to you, it can be a huge, huge factor in recovery. At least one thing that I have found particularly helpful in my work. Faith and things like that. And then the other thing, too, being race and ethnicity.
Absolutely.
Right? Like, have you had a feeling of being disqualified based on your race or ethnicity? Have you had a feeling being included based on your race and ethnicity? I mean, it could vary across the board, right? But there's still things that make up part of your experience, and they're still part of this like kind of larger cultural framework in which we have to sort of exist and interact.
That's I see a lot because when patients get diagnosed with the tumor, if they actually get a diagnosis or if they're looking at it, then the focus becomes that. But what I always say is, it's not just that.
Mm-hmm.
We come to life, no matter what, with all of our experiences. Now we have this challenge.
Mm-hmm.
So all these experiences are going to play into how we deal with that challenge.
Right.
And sometimes that's why I always, always, always tell patients to seek a mental health professional, because either if you can't see a mental health professional, then a coach or someone at your church, if that's what you believe,
right.
or something, because it starts to become very much too much pressure for the family It's way above their pay grade. They're not professionals to help with this, with the challenges. It's not children's responsibility to deal with it. And they're, you know, they'll seek help from maybe their doctor, but a doctor is not a therapist. A doctor's going to treat, well, your labs say you're normal now, but you're telling me you don't feel normal, so I don't know how to help you, basically is what and then they're marginalized again. And so that's why, like, a lot of patients will say, my doctor said to see a therapist and I'm not crazy. And I'm like, no, I'm going to tell you to see a therapist, and I know you're not crazy, but what I'm going to tell you is to deal with this challenge that you have, you need a professional, because you not only are dealing with this illness, but you're dealing with who you are before you ever had the illness.
Right.
And that may not have been ever dealt with. And, you know, and it also, like, people will say to me, well, I want someone that understands pituitary disease. Well, a therapist doesn't have to understand pituitary disease. What they have to understand is who you are dealing with a pituitary disease. And so, because we're not going to find a lot of therapists that really understand pituitary disease, because there's not a lot out there. Plus, really, pituitary disease is individualized anyway.
Right. Each person's experience of it is different based on
who they are.
Right.
Exactly. Or who they've told, whatever story they told themselves they are.
Right. And so, I mean, and that is an important thing to talk about too, like mental health, right? Like, what is that? That doesn't exist outside of the context of culture too. And so that's a whole culture of itself, and that's scary for people too, to get a referral. What is, like you said, like, what do you mean? I'm not crazy. So there's all sorts of ideas around that. But to go back to your question, what was your name?
Dean.
Hi, Dean. I'm Jennifer. I don't think I got to introduce myself in the beginning. Dean, your question was sort of how do we handle, or
How do you counteract it now if all these things?
Right. I mean, that's sort of.
Good question to answer.
That's a good question, right? Well, that's where I have a particular belief in communities of support, right? Because let's see, I'm a narrative therapist. So basically that means that I believe that the stories that we tell about ourselves and to other people have significant effects. So I think that our interaction with other people and all this context really matters. And I think that even in this identity, if we were going to we could draw a circle for this support group. And I think for the most part, your experience of the support group would probably be a good experience, right? Or you probably wouldn't keep coming back. If you had a bad experience, then that would be another experience of it. But since our identity or our sense of ourselves is only in relation to other people and to, like, the larger cultural frame, I feel like the only way we can start to integrate a preferred sense of our identity is going to be within the interaction of other people and within the cultural frame. So to give an example of that, let's see. So that would be with supportive communities. So this also becomes a part of the self, right? The diagnosis. So as you can see, what I said was really small, becomes really big. So does that make sense, though, that if the way that you see yourself is in relationship to other people, then if you're constantly surrounding yourself by people who see you as weak or insignificant or as not smart or not good enough, then you're going to feel that way, right? But if you come to a group like this where you share an experience with people that is the same, and you have an experience of understanding, of feeling heard, of feeling valued, of feeling connected, right? You leave here with a different sense of yourself. So my philosophy is always wanting to try to incorporate more experiences like that, more experiences of support. And I don't think that it always has to be around this. I think that sometimes the diagnosis can become too big, right? I mean, it comes in and it could marginalize other stories about yourself that were at one time really important. So sometimes it's about figuring out, like, what are those marginalized stories? What are the things that you used to love doing that maybe you're not doing anymore, that you used to really care about that you don't really see yourself caring about anymore? Who else in your life could you identify that would see you in that way? What would they say about you? Is there a way that you could involve them in a conversation about not that part of you, but maybe this preferred part of you? Like, say you ride bikes, right? So say it's around bike riding. Like, it would be identifying, like, who are those people that know you as an excellent bike rider, as the person who really loves doing that, and how could you engage in more conversations like that?
How would it help me so?
What do you mean?
It wouldn't help me.
You don't think so?
Not at all.
Okay.
Well,
Because I don't think if you fix yourself, I've been going to several of these, what they call bereavement groups, like from Forest Lawn, UCLA. It's a lot of nonsense. People tell their stories, they're all different. But they don't tell you how to solve it.
Okay.
They do not tell you to say, do this and do this, then you will lose that memory. I keep rerunning the last 3 days.
Right.
Over and over again. I wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning. I can't get it out of my mind.
Well, that's
But
part
who
of
can tell me, how do I stop that?
There's no easy answer.
That's not, yeah.
There's,
It doesn't work that way, dude. There's no quick fix. But
Because nobody
know.
can make you
I know.
to do it.
That's been my
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, well, but with that, I think, and I hear this a lot from patients, they tell their story over and over and over and over, and pretty soon, that is their story.
right.
Now, and I remember when I first got a diagnosis and I first started helping people, all I had was my story, and at that time it was good. It was good that I had a story because the media liked it. I was pretty on camera and it had a happy ending. So I used that story to help patients. But I remember after I had done about, I don't know how many conferences, and I remember standing up there and I said, okay, today, I can't even stand to hear my story one more time. So I know Dr. Kelly can't hear it one more time at a conference. I know so-and-so can't hear it. So today, my story finishes. I've told it for so many, but it's all I had, and that helped a lot of people. But now my story is to move beyond my story and actually start helping patients without my story, you know. And so I realized that and I hear this a lot with patients, and I read it on the internet, they become their story.
Yeah.
And what I learn and what I help with patients is we are not our story. We can tell our story because sometimes it benefits somebody else. But when we're sick and tired and we can't hear our story one more time, then we can write that story as a hero. So we can change our story anytime
We can
want
rewrite
to
it
change
with different
so
meaning.
So now I rewrite it. And I rewrite it. I wasn't the victim. I actually had an illness that turned out to be the biggest blessing of my life. And now I've taken it into helping other people and myself. So I changed my story. And my story now changes all the time. But it takes practice to change your story, and you're not ready to change your story yet. Because your story is very raw still. It's at your heart. You can't change it till you're ready to change it. And you use it for your benefit until you don't want to use it for your benefit anymore. And when you're done, and you'll know, and that will stop repeating in your head.
I hope.
It will. It will. It always does. But right now it has a
Well, they all
purpose.
say time heals all wounds, you know, but
But you also have to realize, like right now it has a purpose.
Yeah.
It's helping you get up every day. And even though it feels painful and it feels horrible, but you are not ready because you're still connecting that if you get rid of that story that you're not gonna think of your wife, which you are. But pretty soon Han's memory is gonna go in a different direction with you. and it's not. But right now it's too fresh, you know. But when you're ready, I promise it will transmute.
Just how to find a way to ease the pain and the remembrance, you know.
Well, this is why when I remember, and it was the same kind of thing, in a similar way, when I went from being sick for 7 years and my whole life revolved around trying to be well, to somebody, Dr. Kelly, taking my tumor out, or the tumor out, and telling me you're well, but I had no life. So I woke up and I said, I was more scared knowing I was in remission than I was when I was ill. Because when I was ill, I had a mission. When I woke up and I was in remission, where's my future? How do I make a future? How do I build that?
You had to recreate
I
meaning.
had to recreate my life. And let me tell you, I did a talk to a group of patients, and I remember writing that, just crying as I was writing my talk, because I said, what I realized that was the most painful thing is there was no magic pill. There wasn't. And all this time getting to recovery, I thought, because the day I get in recovery is the day I'm going to be well, and I'm going to be happy again. But I wasn't. So the magic pill isn't going to be there. The only thing that the magic pill is finding every day something in your life that's meaningful. And by doing that, every day I found a new part of my life that I had to make fun, and I started to appreciate it, and I started looking at every little detail in my life so I could find some happiness through the day, until it finally gave me a purpose again, and my purpose became my life again. But it took a while. It doesn't happen overnight.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay. So I know it doesn't sound helpful right now because it sounds like you're buried with grief.
Sorry?
It sounds like you're buried with grief, and that's probably where you need to be.
Sometimes that's exactly where you have to be.
And fighting still with the dog, with the insurance company, with this. I mean,
Yeah.
you get this procedure done in August, right? And you have to be put under, right? It was okay by our insurance.
Sure.
Anesthesiology kept sending me 3 times already. I sent them the death certificate. I sent them this happened. This was part of the procedure. If they wouldn't put her under, she'd die on the operating table.
Right, you had to
They
have
keep
it.
sending fighting. That's bullshit.
Yeah. And those kind of things,
That's been going for 3 months.
it will, and
Yeah.
those will
And in all
continue.
directions, you know.
Yeah.
I know, and it's just a reminder, you know, too, every day. It's
Exactly.
not like, you know, and so those are the kind of things that we have to just really look
Just
at
to
our
deal with
life.
it,
You have to separate yourself sometimes, don't you think? Like from like fact and fiction, I always say. What part's fact and what part's fiction? What do I tell myself, and what part's really true? You know, and sometimes the fiction is that I feel like I'm never going to have my life back, and that this pain is never going to go away, or I'm never going to find happiness. The fact is, that's a choice every day, no matter if you've lost someone or you're not, or if you're healthy or you're not. So it's just a little harder, obviously, sometimes when you've gone through something. But believe it or not, I have friends that are very wealthy and healthy, and you think, what the hell do you have to be upset about? Or, you know, and they're the loneliest people I've ever met. You know, so I think it's just fact or fiction. It's however we look at it.
Mm-hmm. And isolation is part of what happens, right, when you start to experience the effect of being labeled and diagnosed and feeling like maybe these family and friends don't understand, or your physician doesn't understand, or you feeling rejected by the insurance companies. I mean, it's just so much easier to not interact with other people. And so that's why I think that so many of these other stories, our more preferred stories, can get marginalized and pushed down. So whether they be that you were a good biker or an artist or a musician or a poet, you know, I think it's reconnecting with those who know who that person is, and how can we make meaning of that? How can we draw them back into our lives? Or even if they're not around anymore, actually, there's ways to start to make meaning of how they would make sense of you now. How would they see you now? So that's why I always like to ask, what would they say about you? The person that identifies these strengths in you that have been sort of pushed out by all these other things. Also, I don't think it's enough to just think that we can just be strong and hold it, right? Because that's an internal solution, and that's something that I think is just, it's acculturated. It's part of like what we hold on to. So I think that it's not enough to just hold on to that idea and then go back out into the world where we're constantly interacting with people that are marginalizing those strengths. So going places where we're invited or called upon for our resources and strengths, like if you're good at something, could you teach it? Could you volunteer to do something for other people where your resources or your strengths are looked as a resource for other people? Could you lead a group and share your experience? I mean, Sherman will tell you probably how this, I mean, you probably told the story a million times how the group was started, but I think in much of these ways it gave you so much meaning.
Well, it helped me to my recovery much faster, because when I started helping other people, I felt I had to set an example for them. So I had to find a way to get out of my misery story and into a healthy, happy story where it gave other people hope, because what I wanted most was hope. And so I didn't have hopes, but I faked it till I made it. And I remember going to meetings sometimes and people looking at me and going, "Oh my God, you helped save my life. I saw you on, TV and you gave me my life back." And I remember feeling like, "Oh my gosh, the pain I went through was worth it." The horrible 7 years was, wow. I wouldn't say to that person, "Oh, I wish I wouldn't have gone through all this hell," because now I looked at him and I'm like, thank you that I got to be the one that helped them, and all that pain I went through was worth it, because now look at this person's life is back. I mean, you can't trade that for something. Mm-hmm. But I remember being very lonely, and I was so scared, and I'd cry, but I'd get up and I'd get on the phone, and a patient would call me and they'd say, "I need help," and I'd get them to Dr. Kelly, and all of a sudden that made that pain lessened. Mm-hmm. And pretty soon it lessened and lessened, mm-hmm. until I realized that my purpose was to help people. Mm-hmm. And I started the group, and that made me stand up and do better. Mm-hmm.
You're doing it 10 years now, Charlotte?
13 years.
13 years?
Well, this is the 12th year, because I was diagnosed, I had surgery 13 years ago, and our group started the year after.
2000.
Because even when I was at a last support group, the terminology that was thrown around was just it wasn't surprising to me, because it's very typical or atypical, right? Sick or well, normal or abnormal.
And there's everything in between that, right?
Right, but they're very binary descriptions. They're categorizations they're helpful for determining scientific phenomena. But we're more than a collection of scientific phenomena. We're human beings, and medicine has yet to create an elixir that's better than sharing our experiences with one another and our stories with one another. And so that's why I don't think medication alone, without creating more support in the communities that you want to be more involved in, whether they be religious or whether they be around any other interests, is really going to help much.
That's what I found, that it wasn't one thing. It was like, patients will say, "Well, how am I going to feel after surgery? How long is the recovery?" And I always tell them that's going to depend on you, because these are the things that happen usually during recovery and painful things like that. But it's always up to us to say, and I will tell them, if you start to have anxiety, I personally didn't go on medication. I didn't feel that I wanted to. I'm not telling people not to or to. Mm-hmm. But my thing was, when I started to get the anxiety, I went for small walks. That worked for me. I also had to find a CD that I could put music on, and it had to have a certain tempo, because when I could connect very quickly to that tempo, that it calmed me down. And so those were my suggestions, because I'm not a medication person. I don't jump to that. It's me, you know. But, you know, and for other people, they have religion. I'm more spiritual than religious. So, so religion to some people is very comforting. They can, and I had one patient, she's very involved with her church, and she just had surgery a few months ago. And her church was supportive. They came and they brought the meals and everything after the surgery. But she asked me, because she wasn't feeling that her church was really understanding why she couldn't sing in the choir for now, and that she couldn't be as involved, and she was starting to feel, like you said, you know, lesser of part of that community, which scared her and upset her, because she needed their support. So I actually called her the pastor, and I explained why, although we don't look like we have an illness, and maybe she doesn't, you know, have scars on the outside, that her support needs to be because of the scars on the inside. And her church jumped right in. They were unaware. So I think, like, for some people, their religion is their thing. Mine was more spiritual and less medication, meant more to me. And I actually built a really good relationship with my physicians. They became part of my team. My insurance, now
teams
I
are important.
Insurance is still the bane of my existence, but the support group, and then family and friends were more than my family. So my family doesn't live around here, so my friends were a better support. So I think we have to look at our lives and determine. And I always tell patients, you know what? Maybe your husband isn't your support. It's okay. Maybe your mother is not your support. Maybe your friend is, you know.
So not necessarily ascribing to what traditional beliefs are about who our support system should be, right? Like it should be immediate family, or it should be, but maybe that's not the case. Maybe not necessarily. Maybe that those are just kind of imposed ideas. Maybe we could think a little bit outside of that. To where are we really receiving support? Or where have we received support in the past?
Maybe it's with your bike club instead of, you know, maybe you don't have to say
I ride by myself.
You ride by yourself. You know, I have friends that
I don't race anymore, so I ride by myself. And I ride only once a week, you know, so I can't ride with a group anyway.
No, but you love riding, you know, and you have other interests too, you know, and I'm sure you have an other interest, other than being sick.
Do you still have an effect from the pituitary, and from that it doesn't produce some hormone or something?
Yeah, everything but cortisol. I'm lucky that's the only one that it didn't.
Cortisol
affect.
doesn't the same here.
But all the other ones I'm on replacement for.
You take shots every day?
Yeah.
Cortisol, same here, cortisol.
Yeah, and that's an important one, so that's good.
Yeah.
You know, do you feel too, Brandon, that you have support from the family and friends, and do they understand, or is it getting easier?
I'm not really sure how much they know, how much they understand, how much they think about it or take it into consideration as a part of who I am and my daily life and what I do and don't do.
Do you wish they did more, or does it bother you at all? It doesn't, or it's not important?
Maybe occasionally I wish that they maybe understood a little bit more of the power that it does have, and the ongoing effects and everything that's related to it. But then again, I'm not knocking on anyone's door to talk about it, so I can't really blame them.
So it's not 100% their fault, not 100% your fault, you know, just, I mean, society in itself we need more education anyway. And, but we also have to be willing to share, and that's hard though. That's not easy for everybody.
I know.
And even me, who, you know, I'm a spokesperson. I talk about it all the time, but I talk about it for you.
Mm-hmm.
For me, is a whole different story of what I let people in. Yeah.
Touching on it in terms of what it is that you're really,
For me,
yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, that's really, unless you guys had any more questions for me, that's all I came in with to discuss tonight. I really want to thank you for sharing all your experiences out loud and with me and with the group, and thanks for inviting me in.